Imagine waking up tomorrow to a reality where 20% of the world's energy supply has just simply vanished.
Right, just totally gone overnight.
Exactly. And you turn on the news trying to make sense of this, like sudden market free fall, only to learn that 20,000 commercial mariners are currently trapped in a literal war zone.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. They're stranded on thousands of vessels that can neither advance nor retreat. And as you process that, the market's officially open and you realize the entire global economy is no longer just, experiencing a downturn. It is teetering on the edge of an unprecedented systemic collapse. Welcome to U.S. affairs.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the opening montage of some crazy geopolitical thriller. But if you look at the raw data and the diplomatic cables from the first half of 2026, it is the stark, terrifying reality of the world right now.
And that is exactly why we are dedicating today's deep dive to unpacking the staggering scope and the rapidly unfolding events of the 2026 Iran war.
There's just so much to cover.
There is. We have a massive stack of source material in front of us today. We are looking at declassified military updates from CNTechCom, internal diplomatic memos, hyper-specific shipping data, deep economic analyses, and, of course, reports from international monitors like the UN and the IAEA.
And honestly, the sheer volume of information coming out daily is just overwhelming. The fog of war is incredibly thick here, and the cascading effects are touching, like, literally every single sector of the global economy.
Which is why this deep dive is designed specifically for you, the listener. We know you are trying to cut through the deafening noise of the daily headlines. Our goal today is to help you grasp the true global magnitude of this conflict.
Right, to show how a crisis in the Persian Gulf dictates, the price of groceries in Europe or the production of microchips in Asia.
Exactly. Now, before we really jump into the timeline, let's set the ground rules for this conversation. The sources we are analyzing today are filled with highly charged political actions, rhetoric, and explicit justifications from all sides.
All sides. The U.S. administration, the Israeli government, the Iranian regime, and, well, various political factions across the spectrum.
Right. And our goal today isn't to litigate the politics of Washington, Tehran, or Jerusalem. We are strictly here to impart the factual information contained in the source material, objectively and impartially. We're not endorsing any viewpoints here. We are looking at the raw data, the military realities, and the documented consequences to see where the chips are actually falling.
It's a vital distinction. In a conflict with this much global gravity, the rhetoric is often deployed as a weapon, just as much as the actual munitions. By stripping away the political spin and focusing on the verifiable actions, we can really begin to map out the true anatomy of this war.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because this massive multinational conflict didn't actually start with a global shipping blockade or a massive naval battle. The sources show it started entirely internally. Let's trace it back to the spark. Walk me through what the data shows about January 2026.
So the timeline begins with a severe domestic crisis inside Iran. In January 2026, the Iranian government initiated a brutal, uncompromising crackdown on domestic anti-government protests.
And these were big protests.
Huge. These weren't isolated skirmishes at all. The historical sources document that this systemic suppression led to the deaths of thousands of Iranian civilians.
Wow. So you have a state already under massive internal pressure, utilizing maximum force against its own populace. It's a highly volatile environment.
Highly volatile.
Yeah.
And into that deeply destabilized environment, a catalytic event occurred. The assassination of Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei.
That's the spark.
Exactly. Now, the sources detail a complex, covert operation behind that assassination. But for our purposes, what matters is the immediate vacuum it created. When the supreme authority of a heavily securitized autocratic state is suddenly removed, well, the resulting shockwave is violent and unpredictable.
Right, the internal power structures scramble, and the external posture instantly hardens. And the immediate fallout detailed in the timeline is rapid. I mean, just 2 days after the assassination, Iranian-backed Hezbollah launches rocket attacks into northern Israel.
Which effectively served as the immediate trigger for the 2026 Lebanon war. But the contagion didn't stop at the Mediterranean. Following retaliatory strikes, the theater expanded exponentially.
It just blew up.
It really did.
Yes.
Within days, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain are actively attacking Iranian assets and skirmishing with Iran's non-state allies in Iraq.
The speed of that escalation is breathtaking. You go from a domestic Iranian tragedy to a multinational war involving the entire GCC almost overnight. And then we see the United States enter the picture in a massive way.
A truly massive way.
Yeah, the sources note that under President Donald Trump, the U.S. ordered the largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But this is where I want to push back a bit, or at least ask for some clarity on the strategic logic here. When I look at the historical sources and the explicit U.S. justifications for initiating this massive war, they list three primary goals. First, preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Second, regime change. And third, taking control of Iran's oil and gas resources.
Those are indeed the stated rationales formally documented in the source material.
So as an analyst, looking at those three goals, are these sources describing a single, cohesive military strategy? Or is this a scenario where a sudden crisis was viewed as a geopolitical window of opportunity, a way to use a multi-tool to achieve several completely unrelated geopolitical goals all at once?
That's a great question.
I mean, securing nuclear centrifuges requires precise bunker-busting munitions and intelligence, but seizing sovereign oil fields, that requires massive, sustained ground occupation. Those are vastly different operational realities.
It is a profound strategic question, and the sources reflect exactly that tension.
Yeah.
What we are seeing in the documentation is a convergence of long-standing yet deeply distinct foreign policy ambitions.
Right.
On one hand, you have the non-proliferation objective, stopping the nuclear program. That has been a foundational pillar of U.S. foreign policy across multiple administrations for decades. It is a defined, albeit difficult, military objective.
Find the facility, neutralize the facility.
Precisely. But when you pair that specific kinetic goal with the explicit overarching goals of regime change and resource seizure, you fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict.
You're not just doing airstrikes anymore.
Exactly. You shift from a targeted interdiction mission to a comprehensive societal and economic overhaul of a sovereign state. As you noted, taking control of oil and gas resources requires an occupational footprint that dwarfs the standard strike package. The crisis presented a window, and the administration expanded the operational parameters to encompass, well, maximalist economic and political objectives.
Which explains why the international community's response was incredibly fractured. If the mission was just, stop a dirty bomb, you might see a unified coalition. But because of these maximalist goals, the United Nations essentially threw up its hands.
They did.
The Secretary General actively condemned the U.S. and Israeli strikes. And simultaneously, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2817, which explicitly condemned Iran's retaliatory strikes on the Gulf states.
The United Nations was attempting to maintain a strict adherence to international law regarding unilateral acts of aggression, regardless of the actor. The UN's posture was essentially a blanket rejection of the military escalation from all sides.
Right, everyone was condemned.
Exactly. But while the diplomats debated resolutions in New York, the actual meter on the war was running at a terrifying speed. The financial burden of deploying a 2003-level military footprint in the modern era is staggering.
Do we have the data on what that footprint actually costs?
We do. According to the deeply sourced financial analyses in our stack, as of June 2026, the estimated cost of this operation to U.S. taxpayers reached $113.3 billion.
Over $113 billion.
In just the first 6 months.
And that is just the direct military expenditure, the cost of fuel, munitions, logistics, and personnel deployment. Which brings us to the real cost. Because as massive as $113 billion is, it is a drop in the bucket compared to what this conflict instantly did to the global economy. And the mechanism for that economic destruction all comes down to one tiny stretch of water. The Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz is, without hyperbole, the most strategically vital maritime choke point on the planet. It is the primary artery for the world's hydrocarbon energy supply. And on March 27th, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps played their ultimate strategic card.
They shut it down.
They announced the total, uncompromising closure of the strait to any vessel transiting to or from the ports of the U.S., Israel, and any of their allied nations.
They drew a line in the water. But announcing a blockade and actually enforcing a blockade are two very different things. What does the maritime tracking data actually show? Did the shipping industry call their bluff?
The shipping industry did not call their bluff because the enforcement was absolute. We have access to highly granular shipping transit data from Kefler, which was subsequently reviewed and verified by the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, or JINSA.
And what do those numbers look like?
The contrast is chilling. Prior to the outbreak of the war, The Strait of Hormuz saw a reliable average of 138 commercial vessel transits every single day.
Massive supertankers, LNG carriers, container ships, 138 a day.
Exactly. Following the IRGC's blockade enforcement, that number plummeted. Now, there was a brief diplomatic pause in the summer, which we will dissect shortly, where transits temporarily bumped up into the 50s. But by mid-July, when hostilities fully resumed, the daily transit average crashed to just 4.
4 ships, down from 138.
The artery was severed. And the immediate human and logistical nightmare created by that severing is detailed in an April 21st report from the International Maritime Organization. They documented that approximately 20,000 commercial mariners and roughly 2,000 distinct ships were physically trapped inside the Persian Gulf.
That is just insane. 20,000 people.
Yeah. The waters were too hostile to navigate out, and their insurance premiums had effectively rendered them immobile even if they dared to try.
It is a fascinating mechanical failure of the global system. People always use these sweeping biological metaphors. They say the strait is the jugular vein of the global economy.
Right.
And if you pinch a human's jugular, the brain loses oxygen in seconds. How long before the global economy effectively loses consciousness from this blockage?
I think a more precise analogy is a physical choke valve in a massive high-pressure hydraulic system. If you slam shut a primary valve in a hydraulic network, the pressure doesn't just stop. It violently reverses. It blows out seals and fractures pipes thousands of miles away from the actual valve.
That's a very apt way to look at it. But how does a regional navy manage to slam that valve shut against the combined might of the U.S. Navy?
That is the defining military question of the 21st century, and the answer is rooted entirely in the doctrine of asymmetric warfare. To understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at a foundational document in our stack. It's a 1997 U.S. Air Force study authored by Major Daniel Clevenger on the effects of air interdiction.
Wait, a 1997 Air Force study? How does a 30-year-old paper on air combat explain a 2026 naval blockade?
Because the underlying mechanical principle of interdiction transcends the domain of air or sea. The 1997 study formally defines interdiction as an action designed to divert, disrupt, delay, or destroy the enemy's surface military potential. Crucially, it notes that interdiction is inherently an asymmetric attack. You don't need to match your enemy's strength directly.
Right.
You don't need a heavy tank to stop a heavy tank. You can use a relatively cheap aircraft to destroy a bridge, which stops the tank just as effectively.
You bypass their strength to attack their logistics?
Precisely. Fast forward to 2026. Iran is applying this exact interdiction doctrine to maritime choke points. They know they do not possess a massive blue water naval fleet of destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. They cannot match the U.S. Navy in a traditional Mahanian fleet-on-fleet engagement.
So they don't even try.
Right, they don't try. Instead, they rely on cheap, hyper-abundant, and highly precise asymmetric tools. Aerial suicide drones, advanced anti-ship cruise missiles hidden in mobile coastal batteries, and swarms of fast-attack speedboats.
So they're essentially creating a wall of localized high-tech harassment.
They project localized area denial. A $20,000 drone might not sink a $200 million commercial supertanker, but it can ignite its cargo or destroy its bridge. And a U.S. Arleigh Burke-class destroyer has to fire a $2 million SM-2 interceptor missile to shoot down that cheap drone.
Wow, the math on that is just brutal.
It creates an unsustainable cost-exchange ratio for the defending Navy and an unacceptable risk profile for commercial shipping insurers. Modern technology allows a regional actor to completely paralyze global shipping without ever needing to dominate the ocean, forcing the global economy into that exact imposed delay the Air Force study theorized decades ago.
That makes total sense when you break it down mechanically. They aren't trying to win a naval battle. They're simply trying to make the water too expensive and too dangerous to sail. And the internal rhetoric from the Iranian leadership backs up just how deeply entrenched this strategy is.
It really does.
I was reading a quote in the sources from Mohammad Mokbar, a senior Iranian official, and he explicitly equated the defense of the Strait of Hormuz to the Battle of Uhud.
That specific historical framing is highly significant. The Battle of Uhud, fought in 625 CE, was a deeply consequential and physically devastating battle led by the Prophet Muhammad in the very early days of Islam.
Right, it's a huge moment in Islamic history.
It is remembered as a moment of extreme trial, sacrifice, and ultimately a test of absolute faith under existential threat. By framing the modern blockade of the Strait of Hormuz in the exact terms of Uhud, Mukbar is sending a very clear psychological signal to both the Iranian populace and the international community.
He's saying this isn't just a tactical military maneuver over shipping lanes.
Correct. It elevates a geopolitical choke point into an existential, holy battle. It tells the world that the Iranian leadership views any concession on the control of the strait not just as a military defeat, but as a fundamental surrender of their sovereign rights and their ideological identity.
Which means they are not going to back down just because a U.S. carrier strike group parks nearby or a few coastal radars get bombed. And because they are dug in for an ideological standoff over this waterway, the economic hydraulic pressure we talked about earlier is blowing out pipes all over the globe.
It's blowing out everywhere.
Let's look at the actual market data. What happens to energy prices when you trap 2,000 ships in the Gulf?
The International Energy Agency, an organization not known for hyperbole, formally categorized this event as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
The largest in history.
It instantly eclipsed the historic shocks of the 1970s energy crises. The volatility was unprecedented. Brent crude oil prices violently skyrocketed, breaching the psychological barrier of $100 a barrel in early March, and eventually peaking at an agonizing $126 per barrel.
And behind that price spike is a staggering volume of missing physical product. The data shows that by mid-March, collective oil production in Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE had plummeted by up to 10 million barrels per day.
10 million barrels.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because it is not just about the crude oil. The cascade effect hitting the secondary commodities is mind-blowing. It's like pulling a single Jenga block at the bottom of the tower. You expect the oil to be impacted, but suddenly farmers can't get fertilizer. Tech companies can't get helium. For instance, the data shows Qatar Energy had to declare a formal force majeure on all its liquefied natural gas exports.
Force majeure being the legal declaration that unforeseeable, unavoidable circumstances prevent them from fulfilling their contracts. By invoking that, Qatar instantly stranded 20% of the entire world's LNG supply.
20% of global LNG gone overnight. But if we trace the supply chain further down the line, we see these bizarre, seemingly unrelated spikes. The price of tungsten surged by 557%. How does a naval blockade in the Middle East cause the price of a heavy metal used in drill bits to quintuple?
It is the ultimate manifestation of the bullwhip effect in a hyper-globalized supply chain. The disruptions cascaded rapidly across massive industrial sectors: aluminum smelting, fertilizer production, sulfur refinement, and crucially, helium extraction.
Let's follow the helium thread because this perfectly illustrates the hydraulic blowout analogy. Most people think of helium and they think of party balloons. But in the industrial world, helium is critical, right?
Absolutely critical. Helium is a vital, non-renewable element used extensively in cryogenic cooling, MRI machines, and uniquely in the manufacturing of high-end semiconductors.
Right, microchips.
A significant portion of the world's commercial helium is captured as a direct byproduct of natural gas extraction and refinement. Qatar is one of the world's largest producers of this refined helium.
So when Qatar Energy declares force majeure because their LNG carriers can't navigate past Iranian drones in the Strait of Hormuz, they stop producing the natural gas.
And if they stop producing the natural gas, they stop capturing the byproduct helium. Suddenly, a massive semiconductor foundry in Taiwan or the United States cannot secure the inert, supercooled atmospheric gases they strictly require to deposit silicon onto microchips. The production lines halt. A localized naval standoff in the Persian Gulf directly paralyzes the global production of the microprocessors needed for everything from smartphones to automobiles to advanced medical equipment.
It is breathtaking how fragile the entire architecture is. And while the rest of the world is stressing over microchip shortages and $126 oil, the economic impact on the ground in the Gulf nations themselves was existential.
This brings us to the acute vulnerability of the Gulf Cooperation Council states. Their entire modern economic and societal model was systematically dismantled in a matter of weeks. The GCC states are hyper-wealthy, but they are geographically and agriculturally constrained. They rely on uninterrupted transit through the Strait of Hormuz for over 80% of their total caloric intake.
They import almost everything they eat.
Yes. So when the strait closed, the fiscal crisis immediately triggered a concurrent severe grocery supply emergency. The data indicates that by mid-March, An astounding 70% of the region's total food imports were disrupted or halted entirely.
The sources mention major regional retailers, like Lulu Retail, resorting to chartering cargo planes to literally airlift basic groceries, flour, rice, vegetables, flying them into the UAE. The logistical cost of flying in heavy perishable food rather than shipping it by sea resulted in immediate price spikes ranging from 40 to 120% for everyday consumers on the ground.
And as deeply destabilizing as a food inflation crisis is, the water crisis was significantly worse. The sources document that Iran systematically targeted regional desalination plants.
Which is crossing a massive line from economic warfare into societal survival.
Completely. Nations like Kuwait and Qatar have virtually no natural freshwater aquifers. They rely on massive, energy-intensive coastal desalination plants for upwards of 99% of their municipal drinking water.
99%.
These plants are essentially massive industrial reverse osmosis factories sitting right on the coast. Highly complex, highly visible, and highly vulnerable to precision drone strikes. By deliberately striking that specific infrastructure, Iran intentionally shifted the baseline of the crisis for these Gulf nations. It was no longer a question of enduring a fiscal contraction or a stock market crash. It became an acute, ticking clock humanitarian emergency.
You literally can't survive without water.
Exactly. As an analyst, I can tell you, a modern state can survive a volatile bond market for years. A population cannot survive without municipal drinking water for more than a few days.
It fundamentally changes the calculus for those governments, and you layer the infrastructure collapse on top of everything else. The sources detail how regional commercial aviation completely halted. Emirates and Qatar Airways, which operate massive global hub-and-spoke transit models out of Dubai and Doha, essentially ceased operations due to the multinational airspace closures.
The skies were simply too full of interceptors, drones, and anti-aircraft fire to risk flying passenger jets.
A comprehensive United Nations Development Program study from late March estimated that the compounding effects of this war could reduce the economic growth in Arab nations by up to $194 billion in raw GDP.
Facing that level of catastrophic, multi-vector economic hemorrhage, water shortages, food inflation, halted aviation, stranded energy, you can easily see why there was a desperate, immediate push for a diplomatic off-ramp. The internal pressure from the GCC states, combined with the external pressure from global financial markets demanding an end to the bleeding, was immense.
Which transitions us perfectly to the diplomatic theater, and specifically the event that took place in June. The sources refer to it as the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. Let's set the scene, because the optics of this are fascinating. On June 17, 2026, we see President Trump signing this memorandum on behalf of the United States. But he isn't in Washington or Islamabad. He is standing alongside French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles in France.
Right.
Meanwhile, Iran's president is signing the exact same document remotely.
The setting at Versailles is dripping with historical irony, considering it was the site of the heavily flawed 1919 peace treaty that ostensibly ended World War I but functionally seeded World War II. In 2026, this new memorandum was a 14-point framework agreement. While signed in France, the diplomatic heavy lifting was brokered primarily by Pakistan.
With back-channel assistance from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. But why Pakistan? That seems like an outlier compared to the usual European negotiators.
Pakistan occupies a highly unique, deeply constrained geopolitical space. They share a long, porous, and historically tense border with Iran, meaning they are deeply vulnerable to regional instability. Simultaneously, they rely heavily on financial assistance from Saudi Arabia and maintain complex security relationships with the United States.
So they're kind of caught in the middle.
Very much so. Pakistan had every incentive to stop a war that threatened to ignite their own border, and they possessed the necessary diplomatic channels to talk to Tehran, Riyadh, and Washington simultaneously. Their core intent with this 14-point framework was simple: implement an immediate 60-day ceasefire to arrest the global economic freefall.
Let's dig into the actual mechanics of those 14 points, because this is where the flaws become glaringly apparent. The U.S. agreed to begin dismantling its naval blockade operations immediately, promising full removal within 30 days. In exchange, Iran agreed to allow commercial vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz toll-free for a period of 60 days.
And there were financial components, too.
Right. The U.S. also formally committed to developing a mutually agreed-upon plan for a massive $300 billion reconstruction and economic development fund for Iran. Furthermore, they agreed to the release of frozen Iranian assets and sanctions relief, all contingent upon a finalized permanent deal.
On its face, reading a press summary, it sounds like a monumental diplomatic breakthrough. A massive reconstruction fund, the lifting of sanctions, the reopening of the world's most important waterway. But if you act as a forensic analyst and dissect the actual text of the memorandum, it becomes entirely clear why this agreement was fundamentally doomed to fail before the ink was even dry on the paper at Versailles. It was an architecture built entirely on deliberate omissions.
Exactly. When I read the breakdown of the points, I was struck by what isn't there. I'm looking for the core justifications for the war, and they're completely missing. There is absolutely no mention of Iran's nuclear program.
None.
Zero framework for addressing their highly enriched uranium stockpiles. No mention of dismantling their ballistic missile program. And completely absent is any reference to reigning in Iran's network of non-state allied militias.
The proxies.
Right. If you sign a peace treaty that leaves out the exact reasons the war started, the nukes and the missiles, aren't you just signing an agreement to pause and reload?
That is precisely what the Islamabad Memorandum functioned as, a tactical pause. It punted every single core existential issue to undefined future negotiations that were theoretically supposed to occur during that 60-day window of calm. It was a diplomatic band-aid applied to an arterial gunshot wound, designed solely to temporarily placate the panicked global financial and energy markets. And because the structural foundation of the agreement was so incredibly weak, the cracks showed immediately.
Yeah, the ink isn't even dry before the specific wording is being contested. Despite the explicit 14-point agreement stating that the passage through the strait would be with no charge, Iran immediately wanted to charge quote-unquote fees for shipping services. They instantly tried to rebrand a blockade toll as a bureaucratic shipping service fee.
Which fundamentally violated the spirit, if not the direct letter, of the agreement from the U.S. perspective. But an even larger structural flaw was the exclusion of a primary combatant. Israel was not a party to the U.S.-Iran negotiations in Islamabad or Versailles. They were entirely boxed out of the MO.
And they made their displeasure known kinetically.
Extremely so. To forcefully demonstrate their total rejection of a framework that ignored the Iranian nuclear and proxy threats, Israel entirely rejected the MAU. They conducted major bombing campaigns in Beirut twice during the final MOU negotiations.
Wow, right in the middle of talks?
Yes, actions which very nearly derailed the entire delicate diplomatic process orchestrated by Pakistan.
So if we look at the board in late June, you have a fragile ceasefire where Israel is actively ignoring it and bombing allied capitals. The core strategic issues of nuclear weapons and missiles are completely unaddressed. And the two primary signatories are instantly engaging in a bitter public dispute over shipping tolls. It is absolutely no wonder this thing collapsed under its own weight. Which brings us to early July. President Trump goes on television and officially declares the ceasefire over, citing the continued Iranian attacks on shipping.
The tactical pause had expired, both sides had used the window to reposition, and the reload was complete.
Which launches us into the July escalation. On July 14th, at exactly 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the United States officially and formally resumed its naval blockade of Iranian ports. But CENTCOM didn't just quietly deploy ships back to their patrol sectors. They announced their return with massive, overwhelming force.
Massive.
The operational details from mid-July are intense. They launched multi-day coordinated strike waves. But the specific detail that jumps out to me is the operational timing. The sources highlight that the U.S. conducted a massive 7-hour wave of daylight strikes on July 14, stretching into the next day. They targeted advanced coastal defense systems, ballistic missile launchers, and drone assembly sites heavily fortified on Hengam Island, Greater Time Island, and the critical coastal cities of Bushehr and Chabahar.
From a military doctrine perspective, that shift to daytime operations is a highly significant indicator of the tactical reality in the skies. Traditionally, high-risk strike missions against heavily defended airspaces rely on stealth technology and the cover of darkness to protect the attacking aircraft from anti-aircraft artillery and surface-to-air missiles. Deliberately choosing to conduct massive, sustained 7-hour strike waves in broad daylight indicates an extreme degree of operational confidence.
It feels like a massive psychological flex.
It is.
By hitting them during the day, the U.S. is essentially broadcasting, we have completely dismantled your integrated air defense networks. We own the skies over your territory now. But we are seeing the U.S. shift to daytime strikes, which feels like a flex, a way of saying we own the skies now. But with Iran hitting back at U.S. bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan, is this strategy actually degrading Iran's capabilities or just widening the bullseye on U.S. troops?
You have just perfectly articulated the fundamental critical vulnerability of the modern United States military posture in the Middle East. The U.S. military is designed to achieve and exploit air superiority. But Iran's asymmetric strike capabilities, their mobile solid-fuel ballistic missiles and their loitering suicide drones, do not require air superiority to function. They are shoot-and-scoot weapons. They just require accurate GPS coordinates.
And the U.S. military bases scattered across the Gulf are fixed, well-known coordinates.
They cannot move. They didn't surrender. They launched Operation Aster II and Operation Lightning. The sources show Iran fired massive salvos of ballistic missiles and suicide drones directly at U.S. military installations distributed across the entire region. They struck the Sheikh Isa Air Base in Bahrain. They heavily targeted the Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, specifically aiming for the runway ramps utilized to launch and recover the U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drones. And they reached all the way to the Al Azraq base in Jordan, targeting the hard stands for U.S. F-18 fighter jets.
So wait, if the United States definitively owns the skies over Iranian territory, but Iran is still successfully landing missile strikes on U.S. bases, that explains why the damage numbers are so high. The financial and logistical numbers absolutely back that up. In just the first 2 weeks alone, Iranian strikes caused an estimated $800 million in physical damage to U.S. bases.
$800 million.
We're talking about destroyed hangars, cratered runways, and pulverized barracks. And the immediate logistical consequence of that is wild. U.S. service members literally had to be evacuated from their secure military compounds and relocated to civilian commercial hotels.
Which introduces an incredibly dangerous, deeply alarming variable into the conflict. By dispersing military personnel into civilian urban centers, you intentionally or unintentionally blur the lines of combat.
It raises horrifying concerns about the use of civilians as human shields. We actually have a documented report in the sources of an attack on a civilian hotel in Bahrain that resulted in injuries to Pentagon employees. The battlefield completely dissolves into the civilian infrastructure. And the rhetoric coming out of Washington in response to this base vulnerability only escalated the stakes.
Correct. The sources reference a highly publicized interview President Trump gave to Fox News during this period, where he explicitly threatened to radically expand the U.S. targeting matrix. He warned that the military would shift from striking radar sites to targeting fundamental civilian infrastructure. He explicitly mentioned Iranian power plants and bridges next week. He warned they would not have anybody left.
When a superpower openly pivots from discussing the degradation of military capabilities to threatening the total systemic knockout of civilian power grids and transportation bridges, you are moving into the terrifying realm of total societal disruption, which forces us to confront the most sobering data in our stack, the actual human toll of this escalation.
The civilian casualty figures from the early stages of this conflict are devastating. We have access to a rigorous, joint investigative report compiled by human rights activists in Iran, the Center for Civilians in Conflict, and the monitoring group Air Wars.
What kind of numbers are we looking at for the civilian toll in that first month?
In just the first 30 days of the 2026 war, this joint report documented at least 1,443 civilian deaths. And tragically, that includes at least 217 children.
1,443 civilians in 30 days.
The report specifically highlights March 9th. On that single day, a barrage of roughly 400 individual strikes resulted in the deaths of 252 civilians.
When you cross-reference those civilian numbers with the military casualty data compiled by GINSA, the sheer asymmetry of the violence is stark. According to the data, Iran reported a total of over 3,680 people killed. Now, breaking that down, based on reports from Iran International, that includes over 1,200 formal military personnel and roughly 4,700 internal security personnel. Meanwhile, the U.S. reported 14 killed and over 400 injured from those base strikes. Israel reported over 65 killed.
But if we refocus on the Iranian civilian population, the tragedy extends far beyond the direct explosive casualties. It is the systemic, methodical destruction of their infrastructure. The sources detail the catastrophic targeting of what the military classifies as dual-use infrastructure.
Dual-use infrastructure refers to facilities that serve essential civilian functions, but can theoretically be utilized by the military.
Right. And the data logs 543 distinct strikes on this dual-use infrastructure. The reports verify strikes that damaged or destroyed 60 hospitals and 44 schools. The United Nations produced an estimate indicating that approximately 3.2 million people in Iran were physically displaced from their homes.
3.2 million people.
Yes. And what makes this uniquely horrific for the Iranian civilian is that this massive external assault converged perfectly with a worsening wave of domestic internal repression. The Iranian regime, reeling from the massive January protests before the war, vastly expanded arbitrary arrests.
So what does this all mean? Let's trace the logic here. The primary explicit justification for launching this entire war was to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. We have a deeply detailed technical analysis in our stack from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
The Carnegie report is illuminating. They confirm that the massive waves of strikes did inflict severe physical damage on key Iranian nuclear nodes, specifically the facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan.
So kinetically, the bombs hit their targets.
Yes. However, the core thesis of the Carnegie analysis emphasizes that the true foundational elements of a modern nuclear program cannot be eradicated by explosives. The core elements, the personnel, the knowledge, the resilient political will, they remain completely intact. You cannot bomb the knowledge out of an engineer's head.
Which brings us directly to the massive paradox. The sources suggest that because conventional deterrence, meaning normal military strength, didn't stop the U.S. and Israel from attacking, Iran now has the ultimate incentive to build a nuclear bomb. Did the attempt to destroy the nuclear program actually guarantee its completion?
It is without question the most significant, dangerous long-term consequence of this entire conflict. By definitively proving that Iran's conventional deterrence was wholly insufficient to prevent massive airstrikes, they may have permanently solidified the strategic case in Tehran for rapid weaponization. They've been shown that only nuclear states are immune to regime change invasions. And crucially, because of the chaos of the war, this potential sprint to a bomb is now happening entirely in the dark.
Because IAEA monitoring has completely collapsed. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization basically threatened the IAEA directly. He stated that the UN watchdog would face direct consequences if it did not formally condemn the U.S. and Israeli strikes to Iran's satisfaction. They effectively turned the watchdog into a blindfolded bystander.
It is the exact, literal opposite of the war's stated primary objective.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final macro-level thought to mull over. We spent this entire deep dive looking at the minutiae of military strike packages, the flow of billions of dollars, and the tragic human toll. But look at a map of the globe. Look at the Strait of Hormuz. At its absolute narrowest point, that waterway is just 21 miles wide.
21 miles.
Yet the sources we analyzed today show us exactly how a localized conflict over that tiny 21-mile stretch of saltwater effectively held the entire globe hostage. As global powers look at the devastation of 2026, the ultimate consequence of this war might not be who wins or loses in the Gulf, but whether the rest of the world decides to permanently innovate their way out of needing Middle Eastern oil and shipping routes entirely, potentially leaving the region behind forever.
Is a highly plausible long-term outcome. The extreme weaponization of a specific geography often leads directly to the obsolescence of that very geography.
A heavy, complex, but absolutely necessary deep dive today. Thank you for joining us as we work to cut through the noise, map out the data, and understand the true global scope of the 2026 Iran war. We are deeply dedicated to bringing you these objective, source-driven analyses. Please like, share, follow, and comment on my channel, U.S. Affairs, to stay updated. We will see you next time.
On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel pulled off what military historians might eventually call one of the most technologically perfect decapitation strikes ever.
Right. Just devastatingly precise.
Exactly. They eliminated Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and basically wiped out the absolute top tier of the Iranian command structure.
Yeah.
And they did it in a matter of hours.
Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, that's what they called that.
Yeah, using billions of dollars worth of stealth aircraft, precision bunker buster munitions to just blind and paralyze the highest levels of the state.
Right. I mean, according to traditional 20th century military doctrine, they won the war that afternoon. The head of the snake was cut off.
So the big question for you listening is, if they won the war that afternoon, why did gasoline prices in the American Midwest hit $4 a gallon just 3 weeks later?
Yeah, and why did Europe suddenly face this immediate, catastrophic economic meltdown?
Right. Or why did agricultural planners in Australia sound the alarm that they were literally going to run out of food? Today, we're doing a deep dive into how a mathematically perfect airstrike basically broke the planet.
It really is the ultimate paradox of modern conflict. You can have total tactical supremacy, like putting a stealth bomber exactly where you want it, totally undetected, dropping a bomb through a ventilation shaft, and still triggered this massive strategic failure.
A failure that just echoes across every continent.
Exactly. The goal of those opening hours was paralysis. But the actual result, a global economic earthquake.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to guide you through the maze of unclassified intelligence, military damage assessments, economic fallout reports, and the human rights casualty data that's been pouring out since February.
And we're going to look at the actual text of that highly controversial Islamabad memorandum from June.
Yeah, plus the incredibly grim casualty figures from July 2026 when the violence surged again. And just to be absolutely clear up front, we're not taking political sides here.
No, not at all. We are endorsing any specific geopolitical viewpoint from these materials. Our goal is strictly analytical.
Right, we're just mapping the anatomy of the crisis. We want to break down exactly how this localized strike in the Middle East infected the global supply chain, the bond markets, and the everyday lives of billions of people who have, never even been near the Persian Gulf.
So to understand the sheer velocity of the violence in July, we actually have to realize that the groundwork wasn't laid in February.
Right, it started earlier.
Yeah, the structural integrity of Middle Eastern diplomacy fractured the previous year. If you trace the timeline back through the diplomatic cables, the tension really snapped in June of 2025.
Oh, the failed nuclear deadline.
Exactly. Donald Trump had set a strict 60-day window for Iran to agree to a new nuclear peace agreement. And geopolitically, that window was an incredible pressure cooker.
Because it wasn't just like a casual suggestion, it was backed by the implicit threat of overwhelming military force.
Right. And when that June deadline came and went without a signature, it immediately triggered this regional spasm of violence. Analysts called it the 12-day war.
Which was basically an intense, contained series of Israeli airstrikes against Iranian assets.
Yeah, and that 12-day war is critical context. It fundamentally altered the risk calculus in Tehran, Washington, and Tel Aviv. It proved the threshold for direct military action had been dramatically lowered.
Right. Even though there were ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations stretching from April 2025 into early 2026.
Right, focused on the enriched uranium stockpiles.
Yeah?
But the institutional trust was just completely gone.
The diplomatic channels were just performative at that point.
Exactly. Regional actors, especially the Qataris, who usually act as intermediaries, were issuing these blaring warnings to both sides. They explicitly said the region could not absorb another military shock.
But those warnings obviously failed. Which brings us back to that sudden, violent rupture on February 28. The intelligence summaries describe epic fury and roaring lion not as an escalation, but as a total, overwhelming opening salvo.
Right. The U.S. and Israel didn't just target the Supreme Leader's compound. They went after the economic engine that physically funds the Iranian military apparatus.
On the exact same day.
The exact same day, Israeli Air Force elements struck the South Pars petrochemical facility in Asluya.
And the numbers from that single strike are just staggering.
Yeah.
I mean, the Israeli military stated that 85% of Iran's petrochemical exports were taken offline in a matter of hours.
85%, just gone.
They hit the command nodes and severed the national revenue stream all at once.
It was a textbook application of overwhelming force. They wanted to induce systemic shock. But here is where the U.S. and Israeli war planners completely miscalculated the nature of the adversary.
How so?
Well, they applied a conventional assumption to an unconventional structure. In a traditional military, it's a pyramid, right?
Right. Orders flow from the general at the top, down to the regional commanders, then to the tactical units.
Exactly. So if you cut off the top of the pyramid, the rest of the structure enters operational paralysis. The lower tiers literally don't have the authority or the strategic picture to fight a coordinated war.
They just hunker down and wait for communications to come back.
Right. And the U.S. and Israeli planners were banking on that paralysis. They thought a massive decapitation strike would buy them a window of chaos to dismantle the rest of the military unopposed.
Okay, let's unpack this because this is where it gets crazy. If the U.S. used advanced stealth platforms to vaporize the top of the pyramid and sever communications, how did Iran manage to strike back so quickly?
Because they did strike back almost immediately.
Right. The damage assessments show that Iranian retaliatory barrages were launching across 4 different countries instantly. How do you orchestrate a multinational counterattack when your central command just ceased to exist?
You do it by fundamentally redesigning the architecture of your military. For years, Iranian military theorists have been developing this doctrine known as the Mosaic defense strategy.
The Mosaic defense.
Yeah. They knew their centralized communications would be the very first targets destroyed by a technologically superior adversary like the US, so they completely decentralized their command and control.
They pushed the launch authority down to the local level.
Deeply embedded, localized commanders spread across the entire country. They basically told their missile and drone operators, if the balloon goes up and you lose contact with Tehran, assume the leadership is gone.
Oh.
You already have your targets. You have your launch protocols. You don't need permission to fire. Just execute your missions independently.
So it's like a dead man's switch on a massive geographical scale. Or, I don't know, like a starfish you cut off the central nervous system and the limbs just keep moving autonomously.
It's actually more dangerous than a starfish because a starfish just flails around. This was highly coordinated, pre-programmed retaliation. A dead man's switch is the perfect analogy.
Right.
Because of this mosaic defense, the decapitation strike didn't cause paralysis. It caused an automated, highly lethal spasm of decentralized retaliation.
So on the exact same day that Khamenei was killed and the petrochemical facilities were burning, air raid sirens were blaring across the entire Persian Gulf.
The decentralized units didn't need to ask permission. They just turned the keys.
And the military data from those opening hours paints an incredibly chaotic picture. It wasn't just Israel bracing for impact.
Right.
Iranian units launched this massive barrage of solid-fuel ballistic missiles and autonomous suicide drones targeting U.S.-aligned Arab countries.
Yeah, you had explosions rocking commercial hubs like Dubai in the UAE, sirens going off in Bahrain with verified videos showing smoke rising near a major U.S. Navy facility.
Kuwait International Airport found itself in the crosshairs of drone swarms. It even extended into the Kurdistan region in northern Iraq, specifically targeting areas near the U.S. consulate in Erbil.
And if you look closely at the target list, the Mosaic defense wasn't just firing blindly to cause terror. They were highly specific.
They were going after the physical architecture of U.S. military projection in the Middle East.
Exactly. Intelligence reports indicate that radar bases housing key U.S. missile interceptors were hit in Jordan.
Wait, the systems designed to protect the region from ballistic missiles?
Yes. By targeting the interceptors first, the automated Iranian response actively degraded the U.S. defensive umbrella. And there are even disputed accounts which UK intelligence confirmed, though Iranian state media strangely denied of an attack stretching as far away as the Diego Garcia military base.
In the British Indian Ocean territory, Diego Garcia is thousands of miles away.
It is.
And it's a foundational staging ground for U.S. strategic bombers. If they're reaching out and touching Diego Garcia on day one, that completely shatters the illusion that this was going to be some contained, localized operation.
Exactly. And the immediate geopolitical ripple effect was that the Gulf states, which historically relied heavily on the U.S. security umbrella, found themselves instantly dragged into a massive conflict.
The U.S. and Israel initiated the strike, but the automated retaliation meant Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and Jordan were suddenly frontline combat zones.
Right. But, this rapid high-tech escalation didn't just play out as some sterile exchange between stealth bombers and radar installations.
No, not at all.
The immediate and arguably most devastating cost was paid in blood by the civilian population caught underneath it.
Yeah, the demographic data from human rights organizations monitoring the conflict is just incredibly grim.
It's a devastating reality of modern air campaigns. According to data compiled by human rights activists in Iran, or HRA, cross-referenced with geolocation analysis from groups like Air Wars.
The first month was an absolute catastrophe for non-combatants.
Exactly. Between February 28 and March 23 alone, these groups recorded a verified minimum of 1,443 civilian deaths directly resulting from U.S. and Israeli airstrikes.
And researchers always stress that when they say verified minimum, they mean they have video evidence, hospital logs, and multiple eyewitness accounts for each specific death.
The actual number is undoubtedly much higher because so many bodies remain under the rubble.
Right. And out of those 1,443 confirmed deaths, at least 217 were children.
The sheer tempo of the aerial bombardment was historically unprecedented. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the analysis highlights a specific 24-hour period on March 9.
Oh, that was a massive barrage.
Yeah. On that single day, Allied forces conducted almost 400 separate kinetic strikes across Iran. That barrage alone killed at least 252 civilians.
Wow.
The report notes that this single-day death toll is almost mathematically equivalent to the number of civilians killed during an entire 52-day U.S. counterterrorism operation in Yemen the previous year.
And that campaign was already heavily criticized for collateral damage.
Right. The U.S. and Israel condensed nearly 2 months of typical operational harm into a single afternoon.
We really have to look at the specific tragedies outlined in these reports because when you just read aggregate statistics, the numbers can become numbing.
You lose the reality of what a 2,000-pound precision munition actually does to a city block.
It's exactly. On the very first day, February 28th, amidst the chaos of the decapitation strikes, there was a massive attack that hit an elementary school in Menab. It's referred to as the Menab Girls' School incident.
Yeah, at least 168 children were killed. Another 110 civilians were severely injured. The historical context provided states this was the largest civilian death toll of any single U.S.-involved attack since the Gulf War in 1991.
Just horrific. And the reports also document strikes against the Sharif University of Technology, which is one of the premier educational institutions in the country.
And perhaps most disturbingly, there are verified accounts of strikes hitting dense crowds during religious observances. Between March 1st and March 2, at least 20 civilians were killed in Tehran's Nilufar Square.
These were mostly families gathered in the evening after breaking their fast for Ramadan.
Right. And beyond the locations, there are incredibly serious allegations regarding the specific tactical profiles being used. The Middle East Eye reported that U.S. air assets were utilizing double-tap strike patterns.
A double tap. That is an absolutely horrific tactic. That's where you drop a munition on a target, wait for the local first responders and medics to rush into the rubble, and then you strike the exact same GPS coordinates a second time.
The explicit goal being to eliminate the rescue personnel and degrade the city's emergency response capabilities.
Now, the official documentation states that the U.S. government vehemently denies authorizing or using this tactic. They claim any secondary explosions were from hidden munitions cooking off.
But the fact that these allegations are dominating the global narrative shows the absolute chaos on the ground. To understand why the civilian harm numbers spike so violently, we have to look at the underlying mechanics of modern targeting.
What were the systemic drivers the human rights groups identified?
First, targeting errors and misidentification. The Allied forces were relying on intelligence that was sometimes outdated or deliberately spoofed by Iranian counterintelligence. Second, there was a near-total failure of precautionary warnings. The speed of the Mosaic defense retaliation meant Allied forces were rushing to hit mobile missile launchers before they could fire.
So they abandoned standard procedures like dropping warning leaflets or doing roof knocking.
Exactly. Third, and fundamentally most impactful, was the sheer volume of heavy explosive weapons being used in densely populated urban environments.
Yeah, the geolocation data shows that 37% of all confirmed kinetic attacks took place right in the middle of Tehran's incredibly dense urban sprawl. You're dropping high-yield explosives into a metropolitan area of almost 9 million people.
Which leads to the fourth and most legally complex driver: the deliberate targeting of what military doctrine calls dual-use infrastructure.
This is the gray area of the laws of armed conflict, right?
It is. Dual-use infrastructure refers to facilities and networks that serve both a legitimate military purpose and an essential civilian function. We're talking about the national energy grid, telecommunications, major transportation hubs,
And commercial satellite uplinks. The damage assessments note that at least 543 distinct strikes explicitly targeted this dual-use infrastructure.
It's the ultimate ethical and tactical paradox. When you target dual-use infrastructure in a metropolis as tightly packed as Tehran, the distinction between degrading a military capability and destroying a civilian lifeline is effectively zero.
It's like trying to perform microscopic surgery with a sledgehammer. You send a cruise missile to take out a regional power plant because you need to blind an enemy early warning radar station on the edge of the city.
But by destroying that power plant, you also instantly shut off the electricity to the neonatal intensive care units at the local pediatric hospital.
Right. You shut down the water purification plants, which means within days you have a massive cholera outbreak. So, in the eyes of international military law, how does this widespread destruction of dual-use infrastructure challenge the traditional rules of engagement we've seen in past conflicts?
It doesn't just challenge them, it effectively dismantles the foundational legal principle of modern warfare, which is the principle of distinction. Militaries must actively distinguish between combatants and non-combatants.
But in a highly integrated 21st century urban society, that line does not physically exist. A fiber optic cable carries both encrypted military launch codes and civilian emergency medical calls.
Exactly. When a planner authorizes a strike on a dual-use facility, they're conducting a proportionality calculation. They argue that the military advantage gained, like delaying a missile launch, outweighs the anticipated civilian harm.
But the verified HRA data shows the incidental harm in this conflict was catastrophic and systemic. They verified severe structural damage or total destruction to at least 60 major hospitals, 44 schools, and over 129 massive residential building blocks just in the first few weeks.
And internal Iranian government estimates leaked to the press claimed more than 16,000 residential homes were rendered uninhabitable.
We're looking at conservative estimates of 3.2 million internally displaced persons moving across the country trying to find shelter.
Which forces us to look beyond the immediate blast radius and consider the reverberating, multi-generational impacts. When you systematically degrade 60 hospitals, you aren't just causing the immediate casualties.
You're crippling the public health infrastructure of an entire nation for a generation.
You are guaranteeing that thousands of people will die over the next decade from entirely preventable diseases, or a lack of access to insulin or dialysis simply because the medical supply chain ceased to exist.
Furthermore, the economic destabilization and the immense environmental toxicity generated by bombing massive petrochemical plants creates a legacy of poisoned groundwater and toxic air.
And the human rights reports also point out a deeply insidious internal consequence for the Iranian civilian population.
Right, the domestic repression.
Yeah. While they're being bombarded from above by allied forces, they are simultaneously facing drastically intensified domestic repression from their own government.
The Iranian state didn't loosen its grip amid the chaos, it tightened it.
Security forces rapidly expanded arbitrary arrests, imposed draconian controls on movement, and shut down internet access to prevent coordination.
So the everyday citizen is completely trapped. They can't seek physical safety from the falling munitions, and they can't speak out or even access basic information.
It represents the total, terrifying erasure of the concept of a safe zone.
But this erasure of boundaries wasn't confined to the borders of Iran. The targeting of dual-use infrastructure quickly spilled into the global maritime choke points.
And that is the exact mechanism that triggered a macroeconomic earthquake.
Right. This is where a brutal regional war mutates into an unprecedented global crisis. In late March, as part of their decentralized strategy, Iranian naval and proxy forces completely blocked the Strait of Hormuz.
The jugular vein of the globalized economy.
Exactly. Roughly 20% of all the oil and a massive percentage of the natural gas consumed by the human race passes through that single, narrow waterway.
And when they seeded that strait with naval mines and deployed anti-ship cruise missiles, halting all commercial transit, the International Energy Agency did not mince words.
What did they call it?
They characterized the closure as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market.
Let's sink in for a second. The largest supply shock in human history. The economic reports draw a direct parallel to the 1970s energy crises, but the speed of this modern shock was exponentially faster.
Global crude oil prices jumped 10% almost instantly. Analysts warned prices could easily spike and hold above $100 a barrel.
And the impact on the everyday consumer was brutal. In the U.S., average retail gas prices rapidly breached $4 per gallon, the highest since the severe inflation spikes of 2022.
The U.S. Energy Information Administration and the OECD both issued stark warnings about a sharp, immediate resurgence of U.S. inflation driven by this energy shock.
Okay, so what does this all mean? Let's look at the mechanics. The United States has spent the better part of the last decade aggressively pursuing energy independence, right? They produce record amounts of their own oil and natural gas. They're way less reliant on Middle Eastern crude than they were in the 70s. So if the U.S. is physically pumping its own oil out of Texas, why is the American economy still suffering so badly from a blockade in the Persian Gulf?
It's one of the most common misunderstandings of global economics. It doesn't matter how much oil you physically pump out of your own soil, because crude oil is a globally traded, fungible commodity.
Right, the price isn't set by the cost of pulling it out of the ground in Texas.
No, it's set by the delicate, real-time balance of total global supply against total global demand. When 20% of the entire world's supply is trapped behind sea mines in the Persian Gulf, a massive structural supply shock occurs.
The global market instantly bids up the price of the remaining available oil.
Exactly. A domestic U.S. oil producer isn't going to sell their oil to an American refinery at a discount. They're going to sell it at the new, massively elevated global market price.
Yeah.
So the American consumer still pays the maximum price at the pump.
And hydrocarbons are the lifeblood of the modern economy. Every single sector relies on fuel. When the base cost of energy spikes violently, the cost of producing, packaging, and transporting absolutely every good on the planet spikes with it.
A supply shock at the Strait of Hormuz acts as a massive, inescapable tax on the entire global economy simultaneously.
And the crisis wasn't limited just to liquid crude oil. The blockade trapped natural gas, too. The economic reports highlight the catastrophic collateral damage to Qatar.
Yeah, Qatar shares the massive South Pars gas field with Iran, and their entire national economy is built on exporting liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
And when the strait closed, Qatari state-owned energy companies had to declare force majeure.
Which legally excuses you from fulfilling your binding supply contracts due to an unavoidable catastrophe. They literally could not get their LNG tanker ships out of the Gulf.
So in a matter of days, 20% of the global LNG trade was choked off.
And the primary victims of that were the highly industrialized nations of Asia. Countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore possess almost zero domestic energy resources.
They rely overwhelmingly on imports to keep their national power grids running and their semiconductor factories humming.
When the ships stopped arriving, the Philippines actually declared a formal national energy emergency. The president had to invoke emergency powers just to secure the bare minimum flow of oil to prevent nationwide rolling blackouts.
The cascading effects were causing bizarre policy shifts globally. In Australia, the federal government had to legally relax its stringent petrol and diesel environmental standards for 60 days.
They had to allow dirtier fuels into the supply chain just to prevent critical shortages at hospital backup generators.
Plus, Australian farmers were warning that their upcoming crop yields could be halved because they couldn't get diesel for their combines or chemical fertilizer for their fields.
And the fertilizer issue perfectly illustrates the hidden interdependencies of the global supply chain. Methane from natural gas is the foundational chemical feedstock required to produce agricultural ammonia fertilizer.
Right, the Haber-Bosch process. Without cheap natural gas, global fertilizer production plummets. So the naval blockade directly threatened the global food supply.
And the logistical nightmare of avoiding the Persian Gulf was breaking the shipping industry. Trade traffic attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz plunged by an unprecedented 90%.
Major shipping conglomerates had to reroute their massive container vessels around the Cape of Good Hope.
That geographical rerouting adds thousands of nautical miles, weeks of transit time, and massive fuel consumption. It shatters the just-in-time supply chain model.
Factories had to shut down assembly lines. Brazilian agricultural exporters had to frantically reroute entire fleets of refrigerated cargo ships carrying beef and chicken before the cargo spoiled at sea.
And while the world dealt with supply chain delays, the localized economic devastation inside the Gulf states was bordering on apocalyptic.
The UN estimated that Arab nations could lose $200 billion as a direct result of this conflict.
Because the entire economic model of places like the UAE and Qatar is built on an image of hyperstability. They're designed to be the Switzerland of the Middle East.
But when Iranian ballistic missiles are being intercepted over the skyscrapers of Dubai, that illusion of safety evaporates instantly.
The intelligence summaries describe a frantic exodus. Western expats and millions of migrant workers were desperately trying to flee.
There were reports that up to 9 million Indian nationals working in the Gulf were suddenly caught in the line of fire. These workers send roughly $50 billion in annual remittances back to India.
If those economies crash and stop paying them, that $50 billion pipeline disappears overnight, threatening a severe secondary economic crisis across the Indian subcontinent.
And the financial contagion spreading through Europe was equally dire. Prior to 2026, the EU had spent years pivoting its energy architecture away from Russian pipelines.
They had become heavily reliant on securing LNG from Middle Eastern alternatives. When the strait was mined, Europe was shoved violently into a second energy crisis.
And the timing was terrible. The European Central Bank had been signaling plans to cut interest rates to stimulate the post-pandemic economy.
But the massive war-driven energy inflation forced their hand. They had to abruptly halt all planned rate cuts. They were trapped.
The UK took a massive hit. The sudden shift in interest rate expectations triggered a chaotic sell-off in the UK bond market, a gilt shock.
Investors dumped government debt because rising inflation was eroding its value. Government borrowing costs spiked, squeezing the national budget. Major supermarkets like ASDA issued public warnings about imminent fuel shortages.
It is genuinely hard to comprehend the scale of this domino effect. U.S. health bombers strike a compound in Tehran, and 3 weeks later, a farmer in Australia can't harvest wheat, a UK family can't afford petrol, and European central banks are paralyzed.
Which brings us to the most critical analytical question of this entire deep dive.
Why would the highly sophisticated planners in the U.S. and Israel willingly take this enormous risk?
They absolutely knew that initiating a major kinetic war in the Persian Gulf would cause a massive supply shock.
So what was the underlying military theory that convinced them this was a winnable strategy?
To understand that, we have to look at a specific, highly influential piece of unclassified military doctrine cited in our source materials. It's a 1997 report by the Air Force Studies and Analyses Agency, authored by Major Daniel R. Clevenger.
Titled Effects of Air Interdiction Attacks on Advancing Armored and Mechanized Ground Forces.
While the title sounds dry, this document is the absolute key to understanding the U.S. strategy of air interdiction.
Right. It defines air interdiction as using overwhelming air power to divert, disrupt, delay, or destroy the enemy's surface military potential before it can be used against friendly forces.
Asymmetric warfare from the skies, using high-altitude aircraft to dismantle ground forces that can't reach up and fight back.
And the 1997 report lays out the exact ruthless mathematics of breaking an army. It states a ground unit loses its combat capability when it suffers roughly 30 to 35% attrition of its primary combat entities.
Tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery. The math says you don't have to kill every soldier, just efficiently destroy 1/3 of their heavy equipment, and the unit's cohesion collapses.
And crucially, the doctrine explains you don't even need to hit the heavily armored tanks directly to stop them.
Right. The primary goal of those initial February 28 strikes wasn't purely vengeance. It was a deliberate attempt to apply this 1997 doctrine on a national scale.
They were trying to completely paralyze the vast Iranian military apparatus by methodically severing its vulnerable logistical tail. The report breaks this delay into three components.
First, immediate delay. The bombs start falling, units scatter, take cover.
Second, aftermath delay. The bombing pauses, they spend hours doing damage control, treating casualties, reestablishing command.
And third, the absolute most critical component, residual delay. The permanent, unrecoverable loss of operational mobility caused by destroying the enemy's POL.
Petroleum, oil, and lubricants. A modern mechanized military is incredibly thirsty.
If you systematically destroy their thin-skinned fuel trucks, or in this case, obliterate the Khuzestan steel plant and the South Pars petrochemical facility, you are destroying their national supply of fuel and heavy industrial materials.
You are starving the engine of their military. The 1997 report compares this to World War II, quoting Field Marshal Erwin Rommel.
He wrote that the overwhelming American and British command of the air was a literal sentence of death for his land army because it completely stripped them of their ability to move.
His technologically superior tanks quite literally ran out of gas. And the U.S. applied this exact same doctrine successfully during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 against the Iraqi military.
Unchallenged coalition air power stopped massive Iraqi armored reinforcements from moving. They systematically destroyed their logistical supply vehicles.
So the architects of the 2026 war believed they could execute this exact same playbook against Iran. Destroy the petrochemical plants, crater the steel mills, and the Iranian military machine will grind to a halt.
But this is where the logic completely falls apart.
Right. The 1997 study says air superiority is a sentence of death for a land army. But Iran isn't fighting a traditional land war.
They aren't marching tank divisions across the desert. They are using the Mosaic defense strategy.
An entirely asymmetric war, utilizing solid fuel ballistic missiles, deeply embedded proxy militias, and swarms of autonomous drones. Did the U.S. military really attempt to apply a conventional 1990s doctrine to a 21st century asymmetric adversary?
You have identified the catastrophic foundational flaw in the strategic execution of this campaign. The 1997 doctrine is brilliant for stopping advancing armored columns, but Iran leaned entirely into decentralized defense.
They launched their retaliatory barrages from hardened subterranean silos or highly mobile erector launchers hidden in the mountains.
The brutal reality is you can destroy all the diesel refineries you want, but a solid-fuel ballistic missile is entirely self-contained. It doesn't require a vulnerable convoy of diesel supply trucks to launch. It just requires a firing code.
The U.S. and Israeli planners crippled Iran's conventional industrial economy, causing massive civilian suffering, but they completely failed to stop the decentralized barrage of missiles that closed the Strait of Hormuz and brought the global economy to its knees.
And that profound strategic failure led directly to the unsustainable pressure that forced the creation of the Islamabad Memorandum.
By June of 2026, the pain threshold had been breached globally. The U.S. and Israel realized they couldn't stop the missile barrages without committing to a horrific, protracted ground invasion of a mountainous country of nearly 90 million people.
An option that was politically radioactive.
Simultaneously, the global economy was screaming for immediate relief. Realizing that pure military force was leading to a global meltdown, all warring parties were dragged to the negotiating table.
Which culminated in the Islamabad Memorandum. It was brokered by an alliance including Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt.
The framework was initially signed digitally, then formally at the Palace of Versailles in France on June 17, 2026.
The visual symbolism of choosing Versailles cannot be overstated. The Hall of Mirrors is historically synonymous with the end of World War I.
They were deliberately projecting an aura of historical permanence. It underscored how desperate the global powers were to save the interconnected modern economy. We actually have the text of the 14-point framework. The scale of the compromises is breathtaking.
Its immediate core was a strict 60-day ceasefire. The U.S. agreed to completely end its naval blockade within 30 days. In exchange, Iran agreed to reopen the Strait of Hormuz entirely toll-free for the 60-day window.
That was the tourniquet. But the long-term economic concessions the U.S. agreed to were staggering. Article 6 required the U.S. to help facilitate a $300 billion private reconstruction fund for Iran.
And it went further. Article 11 required the U.S. to unfreeze all Iranian sovereign funds and international banks. And Article 7 required the termination of all types of economic sanctions against Iran.
The U.S. Treasury was explicitly ordered to issue waivers allowing Iran to openly export its crude oil and petrochemicals to the global market again.
The U.S. essentially capitulated to massive financial payouts and total sanctions relief just to reopen the global oil valves.
So what did the U.S. get in return? What did Iran concede on their nuclear program?
The concessions were remarkably contained. Article 8 reaffirmed Iran wouldn't acquire nuclear weapons. They agreed to downblend their highly enriched uranium on-site under IAEA supervision.
And Article 9 established they would maintain the status quo of their nuclear infrastructure, not installing new advanced centrifuges.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The most shocking part isn't what is written, it's what is completely missing.
Right. The agreement mentions absolutely nothing about Iran's solid-fuel ballistic missile program, and nothing about the axis of resistance proxy militias.
How could the U.S. sign a peace deal that completely ignores the very weapons Iran just used to devastate U.S. military bases and shut down the global economy?
That glaring omission is exactly why sources call the Islamabad Memorandum a highly fragile framework. The U.S. negotiators were operating under crushing pressure.
Plunging stock markets, skyrocketing inflation, furious European allies. They made a triage decision.
They prioritized reopening the Strait of Hormuz and securing a pause in the nuclear program over the incredibly complex task of dismantling Iran's asymmetric military capabilities.
They deferred those intractable issues, hoping to resolve them during the 60-day ceasefire. But by leaving the primary tools of Iran's military power unconstrained, they built a peace treaty on a foundation of sand.
And the structural weaknesses of that hastily assembled memorandum invited the almost immediate collapse of the peace process. The digital ink was barely dry before the ceasefire began to shatter in late June.
Merely 9 days after the signing ceremony on June 26, IRGC naval forces intercepted 3 commercial oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz and forced them to turn back.
Iran claimed they were just preparing to charge administrative fees for security and transit services.
A concept they vaguely hinted at, but maritime legal analysts deemed it a violation of international law.
And the U.S. response was immediate and kinetic. They launched targeted military strikes against the Iranian naval assets, claiming Iran violated the ceasefire by threatening shipping lanes.
Iran immediately countered, stating the lethal U.S. airstrikes were the actual unprovoked violation. It devolved into a rapid escalation.
The situation deteriorated entirely a week later. On July 7 and 8, unidentified anti-ship missiles struck multiple commercial vessels, including a Saudi-flagged oil tanker.
In retaliation, the U.S. officially revoked the specific Treasury Department license that authorized Iranian oil sales.
But revoking that export license directly breaches Article 10 of the memorandum.
Precisely. Iran aggressively stated the U.S. breached the treaty by unilaterally restoring the crippling oil sanctions. The treaty was effectively voided.
At the same time, Iran proudly announced they shot down an advanced U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone over southern Iran. And they claimed to have targeted up to 85 U.S. and allied military sites across Bahrain and Kuwait.
So the negotiated status quo was completely dead. By mid-July, the operational data shows the U.S. vastly expanded its offensive military footprint.
And they escalated the tempo massively. The military assessments note a highly significant tactical shift. The U.S. moved to aggressive daytime operations.
They launched 90-minute, sustained, rolling airstrikes against Greater Tom Island, degrading coastal defense systems and a cruise missile storage facility.
The target list rapidly expanded to Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, and the massive port city of Bandar Abbas.
Moving from clandestine nighttime strikes to sustained daytime bombing is a massive, deliberate escalation in psychological warfare.
It maximizes the visibility of the destruction. It's the U.S. explicitly communicating they're no longer constrained by the political optics of the framework.
And inevitably, the human costs spiked immediately. The absolute latest casualty figures from July 15 show over 35 civilians killed in these daytime strikes.
The Iranian Health Ministry reported between 260 and 300 individuals were severely injured.
Furthermore, 7 Iranian regular army soldiers were killed in the very first direct U.S. strike on a conventional army barracks, specifically targeting the Bampur military base.
Striking a conventional army barracks full of conscripts, rather than a specialized IRGC facility, represents a massive widening of the target set.
It demonstrates the U.S. is no longer just trying to suppress the asymmetric missile threat. They are now actively attempting to destroy the broader conventional Iranian military state.
You really have to wonder, if a $300 billion incentive and the threat of global economic ruin wasn't enough leverage to hold a ceasefire for even 30 days, is there any diplomatic off-ramp left? Or is this now a war of total attrition?
The rapid collapse of the memorandum suggests the strategic objectives of both parties are entirely irreconcilable.
The U.S. demands unhindered access to the Persian Gulf and the total neutering of Iran's asymmetric strike capabilities.
Iran demands the total removal of the U.S. military presence from their borders and the permanent lifting of economic strangulation, while maintaining their missile programs as their only deterrent.
Until one side fundamentally alters its core strategic posture or is mathematically tried to systemic collapse, the conflict appears destined to grind on.
But there is one final, absolutely critical detail buried deep in the legislative source material that might be the ultimate deciding factor.
Right, and it isn't a stealth bomber or the price of crude oil. On June 23, 2026, amidst the chaos of the breaking ceasefire, the United States Senate quietly passed a binding legislative act by a razor-thin margin of 50 to 48.
This act legally invokes the War Powers Resolution. It legally mandates the executive branch to either immediately end its offensive war operations in the Middle East or formally seek congressional consent to continue fighting.
The invocation of the War Powers Resolution introduces the ticking clock of domestic American politics.
As the military escalation hits its peak in mid-July, the U.S. executive branch is literally running out of time. They cannot unilaterally wage war indefinitely without the legislative branch cutting off the funding.
What happens when the world's most powerful military physically runs out of legal permission from its own citizens to fight a war it cannot figure out how to end? That is the terrifying precipice the entire world is standing on right now as we head deeper into the summer of 2026. If I should follow, comment on my channel, U.S. Affairs. Stay updated.